tonight. Noyo Center welcomes you all. Um, Thanks for giving us your evening and tuning in here for a great science talk. These scientists have been so generous with us, and so many have come forward to give us their time. And I can't thank them enough for making that, making their voices heard in a pretty enthusiastic crew of people. We kind of drink it all up. So we're really benefiting from all of this. So take the time to donate. Um, Go onto the Noyo Center's webpage and hit that donate button. $10 is what we ask. Great if you can do that. We really thank you. Let's see. Well, I better turn it on over to Fred Sharpe, our honored guest this evening. Fred is founder of the Alaska Whale Foundation. And I'm just going to let him tell us a little bit more about himself and then launch into his talk, because enough from me already. So welcome, Fred. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening.
Yay. Well, yeah, the big shout out to the Noyo Center and to Jeff Jacobson for letting me know you guys exist and all the great work you're doing out there and the incredible collections that you have. I so look forward to getting down that way and visiting you in person. For now, we're very thankful for the digital age that we can be together and celebrate whales. And Jeff has been telling me lots about working with the folks there and the amount of collective knowledge and ideas and enthusiasm that you have there. So really look forward to sharing these magnificent animals with you. You might see, I think I've been working on humpback for over 3 decades. Last summer was the first summer I didn't journey to Alaska, but it's been a great year for me. In some ways, I feel like I'm closer to the animals when I'm in the lab. That's when you're parsing the data sets and knuckling down and crunching the numbers. And that's when a lot of the pattern jumps out. When you're at sea, a lot of times you're just trying to keep water under the boat and hydrophones spun up, and why is there smoke in the cockpit and alarms going off? And so I find the lab work to be really enjoyable. So I look forward to sharing some of the results with you today. And I'm happy to answer questions as we go. Should I just monitor the chat then for people waving hands, or?
No, I think, let's see, Trey can unmute people, and if, two ways to do it. If you want to have more casual and have answer questions as we go, that's great. Or if you want to wait to the end, we can help monitor the chat for you. You don't have to monitor the chat. We'll do that for you.
Okay.
Yeah. That sounds good. I'll get the questions out, and then we can also unmute people if they just want to ask their question directly. I think we can do that. But great. Do stay muted while Fred is talking, please.
You guys pick up my screen okay there?
Looks good.
Great. Well, I just would like a big shout out for the National Marine Fisheries Service and NOAA. They've been fantastic partners in our research, and we're just so lucky to have the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, and a lot of fantastic resources flow down to investigators. Everything that we do in U.S. waters requires a permit from the National Marine Fisheries Service, and they do a really great job of looking at our proposals, suggesting other ways to gain access to the animals in manners that are less invasive and perhaps more instructive. We also interact with them extensively doing our disentanglement activities. So we get tons of training from them and resources. So yeah, big shout out for the National Marine Fisheries Service and all the help that they've done over the years. And a big shout out to not only the United States agencies, but also the global effort that it took to have these magnificent animals recovered. And it's a fantastic time to be in large whales. Several of the populations are booming back. Humpback whales in the North Pacific here, other than a few recent hiccups associated with warm water anomalies, the blob, the population has been doing exceptionally well. And it's great to have them filling out into their traditional ranges and areas. And what I really love about Southeast Alaska is it's this incredible labyrinth of fjords and bays and channels and inlets. And where we work, we're several mountain ranges back in from the open ocean. So there's lots of places for these animals to come and hunt and feed. And the population that we work with through the Alaska Whale Foundation, through Sound Science with Michelle Fournet, and with the SETI Institute. We also have collaborators at UC Davis. And so it's really nice to have work on these animals in these protected waters where these animals are very spatially explicit. When you have all this topography and islands and areas for the animals to come and feed, they can come back year after year. And so we have a very cool population of whales here in Southeast Alaska. A small segment of them develops these enduring bonds that can last, summers, years, and perhaps even lifetimes. So it's really great. And another really great thing about Southeast Alaska is the whales are returning and people are going away. Just about every bay and inlet that you work in, there is former signs of human habitation that is now going back into the land whence they came. And there's something about human endeavors are usually they're the most moving and most beautiful when they're in full-scale decomposition. So Alaska is just a blast that way. I mean, every bay used to have a cannery or a saltery or a whaling station or mining or forest operations, and it's getting more wild up there every year. People have tended to retract back into the cities and urban areas. So it just kind of leaves us and the whales out in these environments. And it's one of the rainiest places in North America on the coastal areas. Fabulous Sitka spruce, western hemlock, mountain hemlock ecotypes, lots of tidewater glaciers. We have right in the middle of our study area, we have glaciers that come down and are tidewater. So we have the most southern tidewater glaciers on the planet, including both hemispheres. And what's really cool about it is that once you go down the coast from Southeast Alaska, you go through British Columbia, and in Southwest British Columbia, you come into the Olympic Mountain Range shadow. And that is the very northern extension of the California Mediterranean zone, of the 5 great Mediterranean zones on the planet. We have the northward extension here, it comes up the coast. And so you've got the world's most southern tidewater glaciers juxtapositioned with the highest latitude Mediterranean zone on the planet. So it's extremely interesting ecological area where a lot of habitats and biomes are quite compressed. This is a little bay that we've got our field station in. It's got fantastic waterfalls and ancient forests, muskegs, steep coastlines. Oh, did I mention hot springs? That's always really nice to have too. So yeah, Warm Springs Bay, really beautiful. Lots of fish too, great resources, berries, bears, icebergs. So it's a really great part of the universe. And if you can get up there, I strongly recommend it. And then of course, there's the whales. And the whales are fantastic. They've, I got my first opportunity to work with these animals back in 1987. I went up, it's kind of like an Earth Watch program with Cynthia DeVincent of Intersea Research. And I managed to actually get through the application and interviews without ever telling them I actually had never seen a humpback before. So it was really great to get my first kick at the can at these animals, and I've never looked back. And one of the things that you do notice, though, is that these whales are deeply imbued in the Aboriginal cultures in these areas. In the area of Southeast Alaska, it's with the Tlingit folks, and they have enduring interactions along the North Pacific coast that extend back thousands of years. Now, down the inside passage with the Diditat people and the Nunachal, they have, it's a very amazing interaction they have with these animals, both consumptively and non-consumptively. The archaeological middens and the digging show that they have been harvesting whales for at least 2,000 years, and maybe as distant as 4,000 years, they've been utilizing humpback whales. And so they have really cool spiritualisms and symbolisms associated with these animals. Here's some petroglyphs of humpback whales. This is Sprout Lake on Vancouver Island. Very cool whaling technologies, mussel shell harpoons. And you can see here's a scapula that came out of a midden. You can see scratches on here from where harpoons were thrown at the animals and glanced off. And so you can tell in the archaeological record about 3,000 years ago, instead of just scavenging these animals, they started to actively hunt them. And it's really cool. It's one of the places that you see a lot of baleen whale motifs are in the talons of Thunderbird. It's almost like these great whales are a worthy sort of trickster, a worthy enemy of the one of the top gods is the Thunderbird, and the whales are a close second. So it's a really lots of great mythology and imagery and value system associated with these animals. Of course, these whales, when they head south for the winter, they our Southeast Alaska population is predominantly Polynesian in its sets of origins, although we do get probably about 5% of the Mexican populations. And where you are off the California coast, the animals again they're predominantly Mexican, but there's a lot more mixing. And one of the great things working with Ted Cheeseman with Happy Whale and submitting our catalogs is we're all talking to each other now. We're all talking to each other through these great animal flukes. And so it's learning a lot about their distribution. Also in Hawaii, there's quite an enduring history of with the Hawaiian folks, Hawaiian peoples, and their interaction with cetaceans. Neat thing about Hawaii is that they had a very peaceable interaction with marine mammals. Most of them they did not hunt, and it wasn't until the advent of Yankee whalers that changing their subsistence patterns that they started to utilize them consumptively. So lots of really neat stuff there to unpack with humpback whales and indigenous cultures. What's remarkable about these animals is, and this is one of my colleague, Lawrence Doyle, who talks a lot about the various forms of intelligence that these animals have. And one of the big ones is survival intelligence. And despite incredible tragedies visited upon these animals, largely through commercial whaling, which began, probably on humpback whales, right around the 1850s and 1860s, but it wasn't until the early 1900s with steam-powered catcher boats and exploding tipped harpoons and factory ships that the killings really started. And during that last century, we lost over 2 million great whales from the world's oceans. And it's great that there's changing value systems, and it's the fact that we're being paid off wonderfully for our due diligence, understanding these animals and trying to manage and coexist with them. There's still a lot of resiliency on this planet that these animals can recover, despite there still being, well, it's been kind of quiet up there the last 2 summers, apparently, not a lot of vessels, but the sonar, military sonar, ships, pollution, entanglements, climate change, all these things that these whales have to deal with, but still most populations appear to be doing pretty well. Some of it's probably related to the ginormous size of their brain, their primary processor. It's about 4.5 times larger than ours. And even when you scale from body size, they got a lot of smarts. The outer part of their brain is heavily sulcated and show you lots of surface area for enhanced cognition, complex morphology, topography of the brain. Humpback whales show a lot of hemispheric specialization, even more than people. They're typically around 99% of the individuals in a population show a right-handed bias. And that suggests, depending how you interpret it, that they certainly had longer brain evolution and has gone to more hemispheric specialization than hominids have. One of the coolest things about their minds is that they're laced with these spindle neurons, also called von Neumann cells. And these are kind of the firewire of the human mind. In humans, and you see them in elephants and some of the primates, sperm whales, they're associated with, well, humans are associated with self-awareness, language, social intelligence and compassion. And so anytime you see these cells, it's like, wow, it's like these animals are probably capable of a lot. And as we exit from our concerns about anthropomorphism and realizing that anthropodenial, not giving these animals some of the due respect that they deserve, it's been a really great time to be studying when we're started looking a lot more at play behaviors, basic emotions, bonding. So we're learning a ton. And in terms of compassion, you're probably all pretty aware of the amazing review paper that came out a few years ago by Bob Pitt and numerous colleagues. And they documented over 100 cases of humpback whales interacting with killer whales. And in most cases, it was the humpback whales that initiated the interaction, coming over and interacting with the killer whales. And oftentimes, we know that humpback whales are subjected to predation by killer whales, so they put themselves at some risk. But they go over and they help out, I think, over like 15 different species of marine mammals that they have helped out with. Particularly when the killer whales are attacking a seal or a sea lion, they get excited and they come over and interact. And they oftentimes, here we see this humpback that's rolled over onto its back and allowed this little seal pup right here in the middle to climb up on its tummy. So pretty amazing things that these animals do, and probably a lot of them relate back to their spindle neurons. These whales can also be exceptionally playful. Here we see some, this was in the Molokai Channel in the Hawaiian Islands, humpback whale playing with a bottlenose dolphin on its snout. And so, yeah, they can be wonderfully interactive animals. This is a paper that I recently produced with Jody Freddani and Nancy Black, associated with a pair of humpback whales that came over and investigated the calf of the depredated gray whales. And they spent about 10 minutes kind of looking and checking it out and showing a lot of interest in a cross species examination of a predatory event. So again, adding to the list of unusual behaviors of these animals. And also associated with their cognitive complexity is their communication sophistication. Humpbacks are extremely diverse vocalists. They have a whole variety of different sounds they make. Probably the ones we're most familiar with is their remarkable songs. I remember growing up to the sounds that were recorded by Roger Payne and his colleagues of these animals, and it kind of set the tone for the modern conservation movement. They're beautiful sounds that they make. And songs are, there's been a ton of research on the humpback whale song. Now, despite not really knowing yet how the information is encoded and even who the recipients of these sounds are, we do know that songs go through this incredible metamorphosis, changing over time and space, particularly on the wintering areas. They can evolve very rapidly, what's called a revolution, or they can just kind of go through a much slower evolution. The songs represent this amazing trade-off between conformity and novelty. The work by Ellen Garland and her colleagues have shown cultural ripples that can expand across entire ocean basins, that can take a year or two for these song themes to migrate across. What's really cool is that these independently breeding populations are picking up these themes from neighboring populations, meaning that they're moving through non-close kin distinct population segments. So that's really cool. And of course, in the summer times, the animals tend to stop singing. The song kind of condenses and collapses into, it's almost like a JPEG compression. What could have been 15 minutes before can just collapse down to just a few seconds of this condensed nugget. And in the fall, when the animals start reproductive behaviors again, the song unfolds like an origami, and they pick up kind of right where they left off and expand back into this full amazing cycling songs. Other ways that they can communicate is through percussive activities. And this is, when normal, particularly when it's when the seas are heavy or perhaps in darkness, or when the animals get more separated, crashing onto the surface can be a very useful way for communication. So we just kind of, here's an individual, and you'll see this is a typical breach when the animal impacts the surface. That clicking you're hearing there is actually my hydrophone strumming, but you'll see the animal's got its pec fin raised into the air. And so this is all you're hearing is the concussion from the breach when the animal lands on the surface. You check out this next breach, listen how the animal actually slaps the surface with the flippers as it impacts, changing the nature of the signal. The animal came around and impacted the surface a second time. So lots of ways these animals can package sounds for their communication. Listen to that again. So in trying to figure out what they're saying, lots of different ways that humpbacks have to say it and communicate with each other. Also, the blowhole itself is a pretty amazing device for communication. It can produce a whole variety of sounds that can acoustically couple to the water, probably give information about their emotional state. Some of my favorite sounds that these whales make are these remarkable trumpet-like sounds when they're socially interacting. Sounds like a ship's whistle. It can echo for miles up in the fjords. There's another variation on this loud trumpet-like blast. We usually get these sounds when the animals are in a aroused state, an elevated state, when they're socially feeding, or when there's an individual joining a pod, or when there's a group of meddlesome killer whales around. So another way that they can express their arousal state to other whales or predators. And one of the signals that we've worked with quite a bit over the years are their feeding calls. Now, this is a behavior, social foraging, using a tool-using type behavior, a large bubble net when they're feeding on schooling herring. One of the really cool things about this is that the whales produce these loud tonal sounds when they're pursuing and attacking schools of fish. Play one of these for you. So these are really cool sounds. No, another individual, and notice how different they sound. So it's really cool in that you can use these sounds to, by getting fluke IDs and seeing who the sound correlates with, you can actually eventually figure out who the vocalizer is. That's super helpful when you're doing studies into social structure, to find out, ideally you want to know if there's what kind of hierarchy or what kind of social structure the animals have. Do certain individuals have certain positions that give them privileged access to food resources, or is it more of a meritocracy? So being able to identify the animals is really nice by their vocalizations. There's an animal we call melancholy. So pretty fun. And the Scott Baker, when these sounds were first noted by scientists back in the early 1980s, Scott Baker working with Cynthia DeVincent and Russ Nilsson, they kind of proposed that, well, maybe these sounds are coordination sounds to keep the pod together to most optimally attack the prey. There's also thought maybe these are just aggressive sounds if the whales are just scrambling for a locally compact ball of prey. and there's sort of an antagonistic sounds. But kind of the most cool hypothesis was the thought that these sounds might actually be used as prey manipulation sounds to modify the behavior of the prey in order to make it more readily exploited. And one of the projects I worked on with Michelle and her colleagues was we noticed that solitary whales were producing these feeding calls. And that suggests that it's probably not coordination, because if you wouldn't be blasting a herring school if you're feeding by yourself consistently over time and space. Didn't appear to be a recruitment signal per se, and it certainly didn't appear to be associated with coordination. So that tended to support the prey manipulation hypothesis, the fact that lone whales are producing these feeding calls. The other great big class of signals that the whales make are social sounds. And these are more like a chatter, more kind of conversational. They're not the flowing, melodic, evolving sounds like the song. They're not these piercing, sort of tonal sounds when they're blasting herring schools. So these social sounds are sounds that you get in all ocean basins during all different behaviors, feeding, breeding, and migration. And here's a little example of what they sound like. Pretty crazy, huh? Remarkable sounds. And probably one of the research teams that has done the most work on these social sounds is Rebecca Dunlop's and Michael Node's group down in Australia at the University of Queensland. And they had published probably more than a dozen papers on these sounds, and they've discovered a lot from these. In addition to being them in all populations and all areas that give these sounds, when they analyzed them, they found that they characterized like 16 basic signals, and those partitioned into 3 very neat classes. About a third of them were were very stable across years. Another third of these sounds were song fragments that got incorporated into their lexicon from that particular year. Another third of these sounds were these social chatter were just ones that you only hear once in a while, kind of transient, kind of hard to pinpoint, small sample sizes. But what was really interesting was this one third of these sounds, and I think they just in their original paper that they published, 2007, they documented over I think almost 40 of these sounds, different types of these social sounds, and about a dozen of those they found to be highly stable across time and space. And that's really cool when you have especially for a species that's so notoriously fluid in its singing, to have another class of signals where you get the stability. Stability is really cool because when you find it across different populations, that suggests there's a certain universality to it, and these sounds are probably innate. They're not like they're learned, and you're not getting local cultural nuances to them. I mean, you get that, but you still get the really basic signal, very likely innate signals. And there's certain ones that they give a lot. And so anytime you have a signal that's found in all populations across different behaviors, and it's done a lot, that suggests they're pretty important to their communication system. And when you have stable signals, it's really cool because that's how information gets embedded. Right now, we're communicating. We have agreed upon set of rules. I'm articulating, I'm mapping grammar onto a sound wave that you're receiving, and it's impinging on your tympanic junction, sending a set of neural signals to your brain that you're deciphering and interpreting, and you're extracting meaning from it because we have agreed upon set of rules. So that's kind of what we're after when we're looking at these social sounds. All these various research teams is there in fact a set of rules that these whales are abiding by that we can learn and eventually decipher, and then maybe become more appreciative of these animals, or even better conservationists by understanding a little bit about what they're saying. some of the studies that Rebecca Dunlop and her teams have done, one of the things they noticed that these social sounds are given by whales. If an animal is solitary by itself, it's usually not producing very many sounds. So when they start to get together in groups, like when a mom and a calf are joined by an escort, the primary escort, plus a couple other males, they really start to vocalize the social chatter a lot more. They tend to get put together in these bouts, and the more excited the animals get and the bigger the pod gets, the more diversity of social sounds that they give. And what they found is that these bouts of social sounds, it's like every time they observed these animals in these big excited groups, and they did various analyses on these sounds, they found that one event to the next, they weren't occurring in repeated sort of patterns. There didn't seem to be a lot of continuity from one event to the next. It's almost like the sounds are being produced somewhat randomly, and they noted it was kind of an open-ended recombination. They did find some tendency for certain signals to be, when they heard one signal, it would be followed by another type of signal. But overall, it was kind of like, not really sure. We can't, the rules seem to be sufficiently fluid or diffuse or uninterpretable this time to really ascribe a lot of meaning to these sounds. So started working with Michelle Fournet around 2005, and she and her team have come up and done numerous studies now looking at various forms of social calling in Southeast Alaska. And this is one of our interns from Pitzer College, Don Barlow. Here he is doing some of the analysis of these social sounds. And it turns out one of the most common social sounds that you find in all ocean basins of the world from the humpback is what's called the throp call or the wop call. I'll play an example of that for you. So depending on where you are, these sounds get named different depending on what population you're studying on the planet. Wops or whoops or throps or wump calls. We call them wop calls here in the North Pacific. And probably about, I don't know, a third, maybe a quarter of all the sonic energies that humpbacks produce when they're in these social chatter are these real simple frequency modulated throp calls. Kind of a broad spectrum. It's got a really strong lower frequency down here. That means it can transmit over long distances with these long upsweep tails, which are probably good for carrying signature information about who's calling. It's also, those attenuate more quickly. The higher frequency attenuates over space more quickly than the lower frequency. And that can maybe good indicators of how far these animals are away from each other. Now, some of the first work that looked at this specific signal in Southeast Alaska was done by Chris Gabriel and her colleague Wild. And they noticed that looking at the Glacier Bay population, these whoop calls were produced day and night. And when they picked up, when they're sitting out there with the whales are dispersed over many miles, they've got a hydrophone out there. When they heard one whoop call, they would hear other whoop calls all of a sudden. So it's kind of like they seem to be coming in these bouts, and that's good implication that it's probably a contact call. Think of a flock of birds filtering through the trees. They're always kind of like making these little chatter, these little peep notes and little contact calls. Probably a similar thing with these whales, just kind of staying in touch with each other. Probably important spacing thing. Probably at sometimes the calls may be utilized to recruit individuals over to say a feed patch that can be more optimally exploited by working together as a team. At other times, they probably are keeping animals spaced. What was really cool about this study by Lauren Wild and Chris Gabriel was that they noticed that it didn't matter how many whales were out there, they tended to get the same rate of calling day in and day out. relatively no numbers, but consistent number of these calls. So it's like you kind of expect them, unlike other social sounds, to increase in their calling rates when the animals are in higher densities and closer proximities, which are starting to get aroused. Um, are you, a collaborator? Do you want to feed together? Or you're starting to annoy me. You just get this kind of chatter. Where with these whoop calls, effectively we had fewer and fewer whales, but they kept up a sort of a similar rate of calling averaged across individuals. That again is evidence suggesting that these are a contact call. You kind of expect that as animals get further apart, they probably have to call more to stay in contact, and so I've been suggesting that they have some probably important spacing mechanism. So one of the ways to get at these sounds, their function, is to do playbacks. And this is an extremely powerful tool that by playing back an animal signal, doesn't matter where it is, it could be a group of sea lions or birds in a forest or mammals on the savannah. By playing back sounds of their vocalizations to them, you can derive what you think the function is based on watching them in the wild. Maybe they're making these sounds whenever they go to the water hole, kind of an aggregation sounds, or maybe they do it when they're frightened or there's a predator. So you can record these and then play them back and look at their reaction to test your predictions about what you think the sound is doing. So that's a really important tool that we've been using up in Southeast Alaska. In 2019, we played back with Michelle Fournier. We played back about 15 trials of playing back these whoop calls to the humpbacks, and lo and behold, relative to before, during, and after, while the playbacks were occurring, it tended to increase the number of responding calls from the population of animals. Again, supporting the notion that the animals weren't coming over to interact when we produced playback the whoop calls, but they were producing whoop calls themselves, suggesting that again that these are functioning as a contact call as initially proposed by Lauren Wild and Chris Gabriel. Another way to look at these, to analyze these sounds, we have another Rosetta Stone to kind of get insight into animal vocalizations. It's kind of a mapping called latent space, where you map out the entire vocal repertoire of an individual using various parameters. You basically you get a kind of a 3D geometry of their vocalizations, and then you could start to compare different individuals from different species and see how similar the geometry of their cloud of vocalizations look to each other. With the Earth Species Project, one of the things they're interested in is if you see certain lobes that are kind of similar looking in the same area, that may represent a possible translation point between the two species and help you, if you know meaning from one species, perhaps you can apply to understand the meaning of another species. So really interesting tool to use. And before we go to questions, I just want to talk a little bit more about my collaboration with the Search Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the SETI community. They're really fantastic. This is Lawrence Doyle, Brenda McCowan, Sean Hanser, and we're also working with Jim Crutchfield at UC Davis. And they got really intrigued by these sounds the humpbacks make because they spend a lot of time parsing deep space signals, signals of cosmic origin that are constantly raining down on planet Earth from electromagnetic sources, trying to see if there's any evidence of intelligence or any biotic signal within these sounds. And they're just like, well, let's think about all the experiments here of animal sounds on planet Earth. We should be, I mean, if we can't even figure out what whales are saying and what, how much intelligence there is in these signals, what the information content, are we even going to recognize it when we look out and start parsing these cosmological signals? So it's a really fun collaboration, and to start running our sounds through their various information theoretic analyses to see how much information we're finding in these signals. It's also really cool working with the Search Extraterrestrial Intelligence teams, because we're kind of in a golden age right now of understanding our immediate galactic conditions for supporting life. And there's been a number of missions now. Probably the most important one is the Kepler mission that went out and has identified well over, maybe I think over 4,000 known planets that orbit distant remote suns. And a lot of these are possibly through their calculations, even though they can't see them, they can look for subtle changes in the host star's dips in brightness of the host star as the planet transits in front of it. I think there's over 12 detection methods they have now. They can look at the characteristics of the light and how the light waves get bent by the gravity of the planet. So there's lots of habitat out there in space. And it turns out water is probably pretty common. So understanding how life evolves in water and how how by looking at Earth, we can use Earth as an analog to understand how complex life can evolve and how it might leak its signals into outer space, potentially be detectable across interstellar distances. So by looking at our oceans, we're starting to model, what could we see in our oceans that if you were standing on the moon, how would you know a whale's there? You're really not going to see their spout. You're not going to see individuals, but collectively, we know that whales have important roles to play as trophic engineers in these ocean environments. In fact, it was probably the loss of great whales due to commercial whaling that greatly changed the spectral characteristics of the planet, um, based on the loss of these nutrient pumps feeding back into chlorophyll A production and primary productivity. Those are all things that could potentially be seen over very long astronomical distances. And it's important to, one of the fundamentals of the search for extraterrestrial life is that in order for organisms on a remote, distant planet to create a signal strong enough to transit across interstellar distances, we make an assumption that they have to be intelligent and be able to produce some sort of transmitter, like a laser or a very strong electromagnetic transducer that can send signals, sort of like, let's say, uh, uh, Houston communicating with the Voyager spacecraft, sending signals back and forth. Those signals that aren't received, that they just keep on going once they pass the aircraft, right? Pass the satellite. And so those may be available some years down the road as available for detection by other worlds. And so the civilizations are very important. And so the SETI team is also very interested in knowing what, do whales with their huge social networks and aggregations of hundreds, if not thousands of individuals on the breeding areas, all vocalizing in this big synchrony. Does that characterize civilization? And if it does, how come they haven't evolved to the point of building an interstellar transmitter? So there's lots of kind of good, interesting philosophical questions to ponder about these beings. And one of the things over the last 50 years, since we've been doing dedicated searches in deep space, there's basically been zero detections. Nothing that you would, all counted signals have proved upon further scrutiny to be explainable by physical or astronomical phenomenons as opposed to a life signal, one of biotic origins. So that's called the Fermi's paradox. It was first proposed by Enrico Fermi, saying, well, there's all this habitat out there. If there's, thousands of exoplanets and in numerous deep oceans and rocky planets and planets of every size and description, why are we not detecting anything? So that's the Fermi's paradox. And one of the challenging things about it is that it's thought, well, maybe life, once it gets too far advanced, once it starts to get a hold of its, evolving its technologies, maybe it just kind of self-implodes, destroys itself. And so this, with technology, you can so modify your biosphere that you may not be able to persist all across long distances of time where other civilizations could pick up your presence. So I don't know, is anything about humans that make you think that we might not be around too much longer? Nah. So fun collaboration. So this whole thing about aquatic mediums and being in ocean science is really fun right now because there's appear to be a lot of oceans out there in the universe that potentially harbor life. The cool thing about whales is that some of these whales, the large whales, particularly the blue and fin whales, they have such loud, low frequency signals, they can communicate over really long distances in the ocean. And they have to deal with kind of some of the same problems that those in the space program have to deal with. When you're picking up signals, our nearest stellar neighbor is Proxima Centauri, about 4 light years away. And so we have to wait for 4 years before we get a signal. And so it's 4 years old. But most of the stars that you look and see, it's hundreds, if not thousands, of light years away. And so even at the speed of light, it takes a long time for a signal to get here. Some of the millions of light years away. So it's like a lot can happen in a million years when you pick up a signal, right? And whales, in some ways, they have to deal with the same problem. Now, when they're vocalizing in the ocean and their signal is traveling, it travels pretty fast. It travels 5 times faster than sound does in air. So it's pretty expedient medium. Sound in the oceans acts like it's transmitting through a solid. It moves very quickly. So if you can, let's say you're broadcasting to a whale, 100 miles away, they may receive that within a minute or so. But it takes for the whale to actually go and swim that distance to get to the signal, which could be a reproductive opportunity or a foraging opportunity, or a fellow companion conspecific calling out for help during a predatory event. By the time you get there, it's going to be long gone. By the time you take the hours or days to swim to a source of a signal, the information might be stale. The opportunity may be long gone. The tide has changed, or the predators left, or reproductive opportunity is no longer there. Someone else beat you to it. So whales are probably also constantly dealing with what's called quantization, or the relevance of information over time. And is it going stale? Does it have a shelf life? So these are the same things that, what problems that whales probably deal with on a daily basis, that also that beings that would be trying to communicate across interstellar distances. So a lot of really cool analogs there. And the oceans, they're kind of a neat place to consider the evolution of life, in that there's been a number of studies and theoreticians that suggested that, cetacean cultures are pretty unique, and it probably living in the oceans creates unique situations for the evolution of learning and cultural transmission that you don't get in land environments. So you expect things to be different and really cool there. Perfect things where a SETI investigator would say, well, this is novel, this is different. What do you got? So it's been really fun collaboration. And Packer and Rattan back in the late 80s, they proposed that oceans probably accelerate the evolution of complex sociality in organisms that live there. Maybe they want to live in bigger groups and they have more complex bonds. They predicted the division of labor, and probably the animals are task specializing. And so it's amazing. They didn't, in their analysis of like 20 different animal societies, they didn't actually look at baleen whales, but they predicted them beautifully, thinking that we expect to see this in the oceans based on what we know about sound conductivity and the uniqueness of the oceans. And probably a lot of the tendency for animals to collaborate in the ocean, particularly for predators, is that when you're trying to hunt schooling prey, it's basically like a big bioplasma. It's just like this big superorganism that you're trying to corral, that specifically evolved to foil your visual analysis channels, your ability to focus on one organism. And so it's thought that one of the best ways that organisms can meet their intergenetic demands when they're feeding on prey that's much smaller than them is to work together as a team. So you get this favoring of collaborations and cooperations by marine predators. That's exactly what we see with the humpback whales. And it's great to have these animals recovering into our oceans. It gets back into this feedback loop. Evidence now that whales can act as trophic engineers, not necessarily intentionally, but they're long migrations. They can move nutrients. Typically, if they're feeding down at deep, they can bring nutrients up to the surface when they defecate, and that can create a shot of nutrients for the phytoplankton, and that can feed it through the zooplankton and the fishes back into the marine system and create higher productivity. So very, very awesome ocean phenomenon. And yeah, so I'm happy to really happy to take some questions with you. And thanks for sharing these animals with me.
I have a question.
Teus?
Yeah. Uh, I was I had heard that climate change, because there's more acidification in the oceans, is actually um, allowing sound to travel maybe 4 times faster in the ocean. And it's getting to be it's getting to be very loud. Animals are able to bring their sound quicker, faster. Wondered if you knew anything about that. I know there have been some studies with drones.
Hmm. And that the pollutants
Arctic.
themselves are changing the sound speed in the ocean?
Mhm.
Well, it
The
is known that
temperature and
certain,
the pressure changes of the ocean. Yeah.
what's interesting, so the sound pressure levels, or yeah, I think there's some evidence that things like boric acid can change when you have dissolved particulates in the ocean. That can change the sound speed. The abilities of bubbles to persist in the water, particularly microbubbles, those are very good at absorbing sound and modifying sound, attenuating sound. So I haven't seen that particular study, but um,
Yeah.
I would,
Check it out. It's out of Woods Hole.
okay.
And there's some papers that have been written on it. Just makes me wonder what that means for sound in general in the ocean and how that may change behavior. It might be one of the adaptations that, you know, marine mammals are making to be able to
Yeah,
communicate.
absolutely. And it's another potential way that we need to be vigilant about not impacting these animals as so much. My colleague, Michelle, she has been studying um, uh, the acoustic profiles of the oceans, and she found, along with many other colleagues around the planet, that with the pandemic and the drop off of the amount of shipping, that the oceans have gotten kind of quieter. In fact, I understand that she is going to be speaking to you in July on that very topic. So that would be exciting to get it straight from the horse's mouth.
Definitely. Yeah, that quiet pause was definitely kind of exciting to different researchers. And Leah's wondering about with the playbacks and how that affects their communication. I know that, you know, if you do that with a bird, you had a bird app and white crowned sparrow's singing and I play the white crowned sparrow, I feel like it's messing them up a little bit. So Leah, I think was kind of, is that what you meant, Leah? Just how it is for them when they hear their own vocalization. I did it today with a sea lion. He was like, he just would not stop barking at me, and I was just trying to take a picture of him to send to the mammal center, and I played it back. I played his bark back to him, and he took off.
Mm, mm.
It was interesting, and a big guy came in and kind of took it anyway. What have you noticed? I hope I asked your question correctly, Leah.
Well, it's a really great question. And as animal experimentors, we should always be um, cognizant about how our study, our methodology is feeding back to help the animal and the ecosystem, and any short-term perturbations to their well-being, or exposing them to predators, or depriving them of feeding opportunities, or just confusing the hell out of them by playing back a
Right,
sound of their own vocalization. It's almost like giving them a mirror, right? And
right.
so, yeah, and I know that with bird watchers, there's concern for species that there's too many birders crowded around,
Mm.
too many playbacks. You can confuse nesting birds, and make them more uh, less liable to nest in a particular area, or expose them to predators. So yeah, with whales, that's a total legitimate concern, and we try to be attentive to that. Noah, goes over our permits really carefully and says, is this the best way to do it? So yeah, and so we built right into our permit. It's like it just says, if you're causing undue distress to an animal, if a cow and a calf, or you're likely of increasing their separation distance gets bigger, or you see an animal's heading to the kelp beds to be taking shelter, or if they become aggressive with the research vessel, you immediately have to suspend playbacks and report that event. So not that the feds are going to get mad, they just want to know, they want you to use your best judgment, look out for the animal's well-being, and so that they can be better stewards of the permitting process going forward to do best by the animals. And this whole nature of playback is you kind of want a response. I mean, you're trying to get a response, or you want to create the opportunities for the animal to respond. Because if you're thinking that the WUP call is a contact call, and your prediction is based on what you've seen, like Lauren and Chris saw when they were just listening with their hydrophone and documenting the WUP calls, they noticed that, as we discussed, that it wasn't, even when the animals got more spread out, they seemed to be increasing their calling rate for the amount of signals that they were picking up. So it all seemed to conform with the notion of a contact call. So you predict when you play the sound back that you're going to get a response, but they're not going to come over and check you out. And that's exactly what happened, right? And so a lot of the time, nothing happens. Yeah, there's lots of little tricks you can use during playbacks to try to minimize your impacts. One of the things that we do is when we have a sound that we've recorded, it's best practices to slightly adjust the sound acoustically, speed it up a little bit, or change its fundamental frequency, change some of its harmonic parameters. So you erase the individual signature variation of the animal. So it's very different when you're playing back a sound to an animal. When you record it and play back its own sound versus playing back a sound of two neighboring territories, or completely unknown vocalization from the same species, same type of call, but if they don't know who it is, they're going to react very differently. So you want to control for all those possible confounds in your study design. So that is a great question, and I think playbacks are something that to be extremely useful, but to be wielded carefully.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that so nicely. I know that I do not like to hear my voice reflected back to me. It's like,
Yeah, like,
oh my God.
I
So
know. I sound
all,
like a chipmunk when I hear my own voice.
we're all getting really used to it. And then the echo, if somebody's like in your house listening to your Zoom, you're like, yeah, anyway,
Right?
so some other questions, and they're teeny tiny. How about Summer, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? I don't have my reading glasses. Is that all right, Summer, if you just
Yeah,
ask the question? Great.
no problem.
Thanks.
Thank you for such an incredible presentation. This is absolutely amazing. My question to you is, I was recently in Hawaii and I went on a whale watching trip, and the guide seemed to be really knowledgeable. And he was explaining to me that during the dark days of harpooning, whales would teach their young, after this collective shared trauma that they experienced, once they did have their young, they would communicate to their young never to go to those spots. And those whales apparently lived out their lives not going back to those places where the harpooning had occurred. And I think ultimately what he was explaining was it skipped a generation, and that by the time that those young had had their young, the harpooning had since stopped. And I wanted to know if that's something that you're aware of for communication, for, after millions of years of everything, and then with the young, and then having them be able to explicitly say never go to that spot. Like, is that something that you're aware of? And anything that you could touch on that would be special to learn.
Yeah, this is a great question, and because it gets at the heart of conservation concerns about these animals, is if you put in a drilling platform, or you're doing seismic surveys, or a persistent sound of industry along a shoreline that could potentially mask critical sounds in their environment from trying to find other whales, or avoid predators, or find food. Yeah, that's and so how they respond to that, and do they leave the area, or they just stick around and lose some of their ability to survive and reproduce. And kind of one of the forefathers of the modern what we call historical ecology was a gentleman who recently passed, Lou Herman from the Hawaiian Islands, and he was a professor there, and he innumerable students came through his lab: Silber, Peter Tyak, Jim Darling, Scott Baker, who are now contributing to the field wonderfully. And Lou Herman published a paper back in the late 70s, kind of doing an historical ecological analysis of humpback whales. And he came right out and he asked the question, it seems like humpback whales are new to Hawaii. Did they arrive here because they are escaping persecution somewhere else, whaling mediated persecution? And he hypothesized that the whales showed up in the Hawaiian Islands because they were, for that very phenomenon that you just described, Summer, about them leaving areas of essentially predation pressure is what it is. You know, this novel form of predation pressure in the form of harpoons along the Japanese coastline. Back, you know, they've been whaling there for hundreds of years, and they would use nets and various ways to drive the animals. And the question is, was that disruption significant enough that whales out-migrated from there and discovered the Hawaiian Islands? And this, it could be, you know, in some situations where you look at, like, you'd expect that to kind of occur where there's pods of killer whales around. Why not avoid areas where there's killer whales, so you can, and the killer whales target the young, and so stands to reason that mothers would avoid that area. Unfortunately, sometimes you just simply can't. When you're migrating up the coast, you know, you can kind of head into the kelp or head offshore a little bit further, but you kind of have to come through these areas, right? And there's places in Monterey Bay where you can almost set your watch by the predation events, because if the cows and the calves are coming up the coast and where the killer whales are going to ambush them. Same thing happens up in the Aleutians when the gray whales go into the Bering Sea from the Pacific. They go through some of these passes between the islands, and that's where the killer whales are waiting, right? So you're kind of predisposed there to predators there. But I would say it's an open question about their ability to, well, the really big part is animals, if they associate disturbance with a certain area, you see lots of different animals have that capacity to avoid that, right? But the part that you described, which is really cool, is that can they tell their young and have a whole generation skipped? I would be interested in seeing what criteria, what evidence there was of that, because it makes a lovely story and certainly biologically plausible. But I can't think of anything off the top of my head where you would get that generational time. So I'd love to see if there was anything formally produced on that.
I mean, it goes along with our deep curiosity, and we just have this like magnetic force to try to understand these animals that are similar and different to us. Like, just the story of the sperm whales going upwind of a sailing vessel that's after them, and
yes,
how we're so amazed by these different things that these animals do. It's hopefully going to be an endless curiosity and return to you, scientists. Is that a story, or is that something that could we wrap our brains around that? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, right.
Communication, what these big brained creatures are experiencing is so very curious and so cool. Karen's wondering, there was a slide a few slides back that was a blue or maybe a green bone. What was that? Blue or green bone? I didn't remember seeing that, but does that?
That's probably me tweaking it in Photoshop. Those were the bones that were on the beach, I guess.
Feel free to ask Karen if you.
Yeah, it was when you were talking about the indigenous uses, and it was the slide before the scapula where there was evidence of hunting.
Oh yes.
On the top right, I couldn't identify what that slide was.
That was the scapula, the large shoulder blade, and so that's an area that's a big area that's near the area where they like to plunge the harpoon, and so it became a site of providing feedback about direct targeting and whaling was occurring when you started to see these scratches on the scapula in the middens, as opposed to just scavenging the animals. And it's amazing up here in Washington and right across the Straits of Juan de Fuca and Vancouver Island, there's you have different tribal bands that align around traditions of prey choice. Like the macaws here in Washington, they're predominantly, the mid remains suggest mostly taking gray whales because they're on these steep headlands where the gray whales come and migrate past or they stay to temporary to feed. Whereas across the way in Barkley Sound, that's a much more of a humpback system. It's much more like Southeast Alaska. You have a lot more fjords and bays and channels and protected waters where the humpbacks come and feed. And the tribes up there are humpback whale specialists. So it's kind of like traditions in mammal eating killer whales versus fish eating killer whales, and how it changes their culture and spiritualities.
Well, hey, you touched on oh good, I have another question here, but you touched on something that I got myself into trouble with the sound, try to figure out an equation because I started to tell kids the story of a blue whale up in Vancouver who's trying to get a date with a blue whale that's down near San Francisco. And she hears it, she hears the call for the date, you know, as the sound travels hundreds of miles. But by the time she gets there, he's already gone and he's left the area or whatever. And the kid asked, you know, how long did it take? So that equation of sound moving through water versus whale moving through water was kind of a fun
Totally.
equation for kids to wrap their head around. But we don't
Yeah.
have to get into that. It's all numbers and we might lose some people. And I see another question, which it's from Albert. And I'm going to have you go ahead and ask that question directly instead of having me read it out, if that's all right. Albert.
Yeah,
Great.
my question was if language is something that only humans have, how do we develop some way to understand the communication between whales without using words or human analogs? Did I articulate it correctly?
So go ahead.
How do we think like a whale?
How do we think like a whale will, or how do we think like a whale? Get inside a whale's head.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, you know, there's a word for that. It's called Umwelt. Umwelt, it's a German word meaning the sensory world, or what is the internal world of these animals, and really challenging to figure out. But you know, I would say, I mean, think of pets in your life. You know, you hang around your dogs and your cats long enough, you start to get a pretty good idea of where their head's at, right? Just based on whether they're in a pro-social mood or whether they're hungry or whether they want to play or they want you to leave them alone. And you can see them making little comfort movements and adjusting themselves, little vocalizations. I mean, there's 1,000 little cues when you study any animals in their environment, even a humanized environments, to gain insight into what they're thinking. The other day I was watching my brother's cat. It was sitting outside and the birds were singing in the morning. And so I could see the cat, when a bird would vocalize, I could see it rotate its head, you know, and I could hear things that the cat wasn't cueing in on. And that suggests that it was either sound pressure level was too low for the animal to hear it, or it was outside of its normal frequency range, or it just wasn't a relevant signal. But I felt like after about 20 minutes, I kind of felt like I had a pretty good idea of where that cat's plane of focus was and what kind of signals it was being attentive to. Anything that sounded like a predator or a raven, it would just kind of like key on right away. But also like little tweety songbirds. So yeah, I feel like, of course, we're not whales, and so until we get to the point where we can actually have a lingua franca with them and communicate with them, it's always going to be a big question. I see Jeff Jacobson's on here. I don't know if he wants to jump in and provide any insight into that question, but it is a great question. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Oh, yeah,
Hi,
lots
Jeff.
of thoughts that wander and all that. He was asking about language and that we're an animal that has language. It's really hard for us to get outside our language. We're always trying to interpret language in other animals, thinking they're just like us. Well, all our behavior didn't evolve overnight just for us. All our emotions, all that capability is a long-term evolutionary event. So we're valid in sensing an animal's emotions and etc. Though to get in the water with like a singing humpback whale, where you feel the sound vibrate through your body, where the sound travels almost 5 times faster through the water than in air, it's a whole nother world and of volume and vast distances. So even though we overlap a bit, for as much as we do that, we're still left on the wrong side of the air-water interface. Though through a lot of collaboration and use of our language amongst ourselves, I think we've come a really long way towards that understanding, and even faster now than we were before.
Yeah, and that's a great thought. And we're doing a lot better about, rather than just necessarily trying to impose our language on the animals, try to figure out, where they're coming from and what they're sort of like starting to use their, their playback of their vocalization, use their gestures, use the symbols and the behaviors that we see to mimic those to communicate with the animal, rather than trying to teach them Italian or something. A neat area that we're exploring with right now is how bubbles might be a form of communication. There's a ton of research that have looked at bubbles in the toothed whales, into dolphins and porpoises and killer whales, because they're obviously more amenable to managed care in aquariums and laboratories. And so we can do a lot more observations of these animals in those contexts. And so we know a lot about bubbles in dolphins, and they do appear to have tend to vary depending on the type of bubble structure, whether they're curious or whether they're aggressive or whether it's a play solicitation. They will produce different types of bubble structures. And one of the things that we noticed amongst humpbacks, you've had a number of reports now of humpbacks blowing these really large bubble rings, single individual toroidal rings. They're not a bubble net for hunting. These are actually just almost like play toys where they produce, dolphins do it quite a bit in captivity, and we're starting to see humpback whales doing it out there. And so oftentimes it was when it approached a whale watch vessel or research boat, it was oriented towards it and would produce these bubble rings. It's like that, the way to get at that now is to respond, create a bubble ring yourself. That's one of the basic tenets of play behavior, is that it's spontaneous. It's usually in a fun, safe context. And when you want to play socially, you mirror first and then you innovate. And it's one of the basics of play. And so when we appear to be getting, so far as we can tell, we've never seen bubble rings being deployed from humpback to humpback, only between humpbacks to humans. And so there's a perfect opening to create some bubble structures and try to answer the animal and see where it goes. So yeah, it's pretty exciting trying to communicate with animals in the wild.
Definitely, and without getting our own human stuff involved. If you see a humpback who's got a little sea lion on its flipper, and to not anthropomorphize,
right.
but and yet, let's allow ourselves some of that joy in taking that incredible thing in. I can't help but allow, to think of humans taking that in a way that we want to, because it brings such joy, in a sense. It's certainly for the sea lion, not so for the killer whale. It's whatever. It's amazing to see. Just
Right.
fascinating. I think Sherry Goforth was maybe she missed the upper and lower frequency at which you were able to record humpback whales. She's let's see. What are the frequency range upper and lower limits which you have recorded for humpback whale vocalizations?
Well, it's really cool. That's a great question because it's remarkable how much overlap there is between humans and humpbacks. We're sort of, our range, auditory range, is about 20 hertz when you're a young human, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And start to lose our upper end as we age. But humpbacks, much of their vocalization occurs within that range. In fact, the fundamental frequency is usually around 250 hertz up to about 900 hertz, maybe one kilohertz. And so it's really cool. There's an amazing amount of overlap. Now with many species of cetaceans, like the Adonisites, the toothed whales, they echolocate, they can have very high frequencies, well up over 100, 150 kilohertz. And you need special equipment to be able to hear that. By the same token, some of the fin whales and blue whales, they're happening at frequency hearings below ours. And so oftentimes you're both limited by what you can hear. You're also very limited by the kind of equipment that you use to deploy to listen to these animals. So that's a great question because you always want to ask yourself, what are you missing? And very importantly, do the signals that these animals produce, are we being attentive to the aspects of the stimuli that they're attentive to? So yeah, great question.
A lot of great questions here. Elizabeth is wondering, she's completely fascinated by humpback whales fascinated by that interaction of the humpback whale saving the seal from the killer whale and having it jump on its flipper to save it. Does this happen? Let's see, sorry. Does this happen or has it been seen often? Or can you share more about that? Those fantastic humpback interactions?
I would like to refer you to Bob Pittman's paper and 2017, and it's a fantastic. They went out and did, and they queried literally hundreds of their colleagues for observations of this behavior, and they documented over 100 incidents, even extending to species of fish, like ocean sunfish have been the beneficiaries of the humpbacks' predatory protection services. So, so that tells you, yeah, that there's some amazing empathetic tuggings in their makeup, right? And it's since they are subjected to predation by sharks and killer whales, is it just a spillover, or is it misplaced? Or I mean, we see humans doing lots of things that appear kind of maladaptive, but yet we carry on. And so why not grant that to the whales once in a while? And the humpbacks are amazing. From actually spending a lot of years with these animals and putting on tags, getting tissue samples, helping them out of entanglement events. It's like you can certainly annoy them, but they have a reputation as being fighters. The research that was done by John Ford, looking at the different species of baleen whales, right whales, gray whales, bowhead whales, and humpbacks, they're fighters. They hang around and engage the predator, where the more tubular, longer rorquals, like the blue fin, sei whales, minke whales, they try to get out of dodge. They just try to use speed, deep diving. So humpbacks, they have fighting in their nature. I mean, they're sort of known as fighters, right? The males in Hawaii or on the breeding grounds, combative, kind of, it's almost like cage fighting, right? They kind of gave up tooth and nail for flipper and baleen, so they don't have quite the offensive weapons that they probably once did. But they can be really boisterous. They can mob predators. They can fight off predators, but yet they're just so incredibly gentle at the same part too, right? Amazing behavioral bandwidth. But that paper, I'll if you can, maybe I'll post my email. So if anyone has any further questions, or if they want access to some of these documents, I'd be happy to supply that.
Perfect. Yeah, go ahead and put that in the chat, and Trey will get it down, and if you miss it, we can share that out with folks. One last question for you before we let you go. I know it's been, we're getting into the woods with time here. Someone was just wondering, I think they were on a trip in the inward passage, sitting on the deck, and was hearing humpbacks singing, and if that's unusual. I think I've heard them once in a kayak where I could actually hear their vocalization, and I know people have heard it underwater while they're swimming in Hawaii, but from the deck, is that unusual?
On a vessel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really depends on the kind of the ambient conditions, how much noise there is in the ocean, whether if it's calm or not, how much surface disturbance there is.
Right.
It depends on the characteristics of the hull and how well it transduces underwater sounds up to through the air. I've got some friends who are they spend a lot of kayaking around humpbacks, and they can hear feeding calls. You know, they don't have any. They're just sitting in their kayak. They can hear them coming up through the water, and you can kind of even get crude directional information. You know, I've been watching humpback whales above water without the aid of a hydrophone, well over a mile away, and I can hear them just with my ear, right,
Wow.
coming up through the ocean. So yeah, the sounds can. They lose most of their energy when they. About 95% of the 98% of the acoustic energy. It's like the surface is just like a big mirror. It bounces sounds in the atmosphere back up, and it sounds from underneath the water, it bounces them back down into the water. So it's a huge impedance between these two mediums. But some of it does bleed through, and so absolutely, it's very very privileged to be able to hear sounds, unaided sounds like that. It's really neat.
Really neat. I see that Charles Burton has one other question here. It's pretty long. I'm squinting at a tiny screen. I mean, the screen's big, but I can't read the words. Charles, do you want to ask this last question, and then we'll let Fred get on with his evening?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you really well. Thanks. Perfect.
So let me go back here to what I typed. So I was just wondering if there's been any neuroanatomical studies of whales or other species, for that matter, that have shown any similarities between human brain anatomy and whale or animal anatomy that have led to specific hypotheses or discoveries that have increased our understanding of animal communication. So, for example, do they have areas very similar to Broca's and Wernicke's area that seem to function in a similar manner?
Mm-hmm. Great question. The research on spindle neurons by Huff and Vandergeld, they noted that in certain cortical areas, the density of the spindle neurons equaled or exceeded that of humans. So that suggests some great capacity there. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on that? Chuck's great question.
Ask Laurie Marino.
Yeah, yep. She's an anatomist. I mean, I guess certainly the overall size of the brain is pretty, that's pretty indicative of some higher cognitive capabilities. We know a lot more about the toothed whales because again, we can get them into managed care. Whereas the baleen whales, it's a wide open question. And that increases the value of the playbacks. Charles, you have my email. If you want to send me your question, I would be delighted to bring that up with continue the discussion going with Laurie Marino or Diana Reese, who would probably have more up-to-date information on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
I can add a little bit more to that now that I remember it, is that like the killer whale brain, its whole organization and the way it's shaped is so different than ours. And the density of neurons in the frontal cortex, that area of our sociality, is so much more highly developed than most terrestrial animals, or all of them, long-lived, large-brained mammals. These guys have group mind. Their sociality is so intense And to leave the group is like suicide. The group is life. And so when animals like pilot whales come and strand on a beach, they don't go off the beach. They come right back if you push them in the water. So it ties into this intense sociality and deep culture that they have that we're just beginning to figure out.
Key, they're just beginning to figure out, again, that mystery. And oftentimes just say, let the mystery be. I love the mystery. Keep us guessing. All right, folks, we'll let you get to your evening, and thank you, Fred.
Thank
That
you,
was
Fred.
really
That was
fun.
great.
Thanks,
My
everybody.
pleasure. It's been a blast.
Stay in touch.
I look
if
forward to
you
getting you
can,
meeting in person someday.
Yes, please come visit us. You're doing
Yes.
great stuff. Absolutely, come for a visit. All right, thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Awesome. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.